Another minute until. How's it going? Louder? Closer. There we go. All right, thank you for attending. My name is Casey Root. I'm a hydrologist for the USGS Water Science Center. This is my first foray into the Great Salt Lake science, really. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about something that I've been part of the last year or so. And so today I'm going to talk to you about developing new topographic baseline for Great Salt Lake. So part of this work was putting together, assimilating a topobathymetric data set using existing data sets, repurpose and put together for water consumption in a time that we needed for baseline Great Salt Lake. And so I'll just be going over some of the background on how I came to be part of this study with the USGS, some of the objectives and how I went about doing this based on other projects that I've been part of, and then look at some of the more in-depth methods for how I put this all together. We'll look at some of the results and applications of the data set moving forward. So just a brief background. I'm coming from work in the upper Colorado river basin mostly, and like how. And so while I was working on one crisis in the southeast, obviously Great Salt Lake was undergoing its own changes in the last few years. And so I picked a couple of dates out of here out of the last few years. April 2020, the notable date, most of us know where we were at that point in time. I was in my basement, and there was recovering from an earthquake and trying to deal with the new. More towards me? Okay, there we go. And so that was just a good point for reference. It was also the last time that the lake was as high as it is this year. And so it was about 4194.7 in the south arm, 4194.2 in the north, and that equated to roughly 1,100 square miles in surface area and 11.9 million acre feet in volume. And so I'm putting the cart before the horse a little bit here. These are numbers that I pulled from my own data set to present here. But then fast forward 18 months, just 18 months to October and November of 2022. And the level dropped to 41.7, and that equates to about 890 square feet per square miles, and 7.1 million acre feet in volume. So for for just comparison's sake, that's about a 20% decrease from what it was in April 2020, and a 35% decrease in volume from April 2020. And so I have a graphic here that's pulled from this data set that I put together. The blue is where it was the footprint of Great Salt Lake in April 2022. The pink or orange in October 2022. It doesn't look like much, at least from the top down, but in terms of actual volume, it is quite substantial. And then, so just grabbing satellite imagery from Sentinel in the shortwave infrared, kind of really highlights that change over those 18 months. And so this kind of presented this need for a comprehensive topobathymetric data set in 2022, when I was starting to unload my Lake Powell work previously. And so in the past, the USGS has had reports by Rob Baskin of bathymetry for Great Salt Lake, and that's kind of been the baseline data for the last 20 years or so. But Rob published those in a format that was usable back in the mid-2000s. That's as a PDF, and in the geospatial world, that's not exactly the most usable format. And at some point, he shared the source data with David Tarbotten with Utah State, and he hosted it on HydroShare and did some other changes to it and presented his own tables. And that's been usable for now, but in the last year or so, just being around our office out in West Valley, I would hear various people, namely Kristen Rumsey, walking around and saying, it'd be great if we had higher resolution tables. And she has a whole host of studies going on. Namely, I asked her for a list and I just put them all on. You can attribute most of them to her. Salt cycling, nutrient mass balance, volume-weighted salinity concentrations and salinity forecasting, water balance modeling, mineral extraction studies, and then separately some dust studies that Molly Blackwood is going to talk about today. I understand, yes. And so Christine and others in the office are involved with this, and it gave me the opportunity to be a part of some of the foundational pieces for some of those studies by volumetric estimates for her studies and others, as well as some of the other foundational data that goes into it, collection of data on the lake itself. While I'm sitting behind a computer screen putting these massive data files together, we have people on the lake, Hannah McElwain, for instance, Betsy DeVesky, and Erica Brown, and of course Amy Carlson, which all these names, they should become commonplace for data coming out of the USGS realm. Okay, so just looking at the approach for all this, this is kind of right in my wheelhouse because just years ago, in 2018, the USGS was involved in a foreign program on Lake Powell, and in support of that, I put together a digital elevation model using contour maps from the 1940s and 50s. And so that involved digitizing these old contour maps and then interpolating them into a three-dimensional geospatial readable format. And so that was part one of that. And then the second part, a few years later, put together another report that updated the estimates for storage capacity in Lake Powell using topographic data that had been surveyed in 2017 and 2018, led by Rob Baskin, who is now retired from USGS. So this marks the second study that I'm kind of treading in the wake of Rob Baskin. If any of you know, he's well equipped to handle these large studies. And so with these two studies kind of in my pocket, it was an easy jump to get into Great Salt Lake and be able to put these data sets that already existed separately and bake them into something that was more usable for some of the models and some of the studies and continue to go on. Okay, so just looking at some of the source data sets, specifically the bathymetry that Rob Aston did. He surveyed the south arm of Great Salt Lake between 2002 and 2004, and then the north arm in 2005, and published the reports and maps associated with those surveys the following years from those surveys. So these maps in particular, they incorporate the bathymetry that Rob was surveying himself, but then also pulled in contour data from less accurate, older contour maps that the USGS produced on a 1 to 24,000 scale contour maps. And the maps he put out had 1 foot contour intervals, and then for the tables that he calculated area and volume at 0.5 foot intervals. And so he published these in the legacy vertical datum of the National Geodetic vertical datum of 1929, which in the geospatial world and the geography world, that's outdated. That's specific to legacy data. And so our stream gauges, our lake level gauges for the Great Salt Lake, they all read off of that old format. And so these maps feed right back into it. But in a modern sense, it's not quite the same. And again, these were reports that were done before USGS was able to publish GIS readable formats on our archive website, ScienceBase, that is so critical today. The second data set that goes into this new data set is a high resolution LiDAR digital elevation model that was done by the state in 2016. It's follows all modern standards. It's between 0.5 meter and 1 meter resolution. Beautiful data, and it's really well reported. It's easily accessible, and it was just really perfect because it was also flown when the lake was much lower than when Rob was doing the imagery. So there's a nice overlap between where Rob was able to survey on top of the water and where the LiDAR was able to hit the land surface. So you want to have that overlap so that you can round trip whatever you're getting. And this is just a conceptual model of how this all goes together. It's really quite simple. It's big data, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really straightforward. So in the blue, I start with the contour data, interpolate that into interpolated three-dimensional raster for GIS, and then take the LiDAR that was shot in 2016, assimilate them, stitch them together to form your topographic. And then from there you can play volumetrics and start calculating surface area and volume. And so what this looks like, on the left, on the bottom left, we start with these PDF maps. And Rob had the source data. Again, there wasn't really a great way to publish these at the time. They existed, and so we kept them and was able to pass them on for further work. But we go from a PDF format to a vectorized format so that I can interpolate and get a three-dimensional surface between the contours. And that's a pretty straightforward process, especially coming from Lake Powell, where the morphology of Glen Canyon was, lots of canyons, lots of twists and turns and cliffs. Great Salt Lake is a big map, so it's relatively straightforward in that regard. The causeways kind of throw things off a little bit. It translates really beautifully to three-dimensional surface. And so in that top image, I also point out the red contour lines there. Those represent elevation in the original contour maps that were from old contour maps. They weren't actual bathymetry. I think the error on those were up to 30 meters. So, it was great. It was great for the time. This was a whole different era, and it's just one of those things to keep in mind with this data set is that one, not all of it was bathymetry, but it was a different time as well. And so now we've moved into centimeter scale measurements, and this is tried to fill in the gap of a lack of bathymetry for Great Salt Lake. And so that kind of tidies up the bathymetry part of it. And then with the 2016 LiDAR, that's already done. That was already published and ready to go. And so it's really a matter of just stitching together and making sure everything lines up correctly. And that includes making sure that the datums are all lining up as well, which is a whole different discussion in and of itself. But it's not a straightforward task to go from National Geographic vertical data of 1929 to modern North American vertical data of 1988. And so that's a geographer's duty to make sure that everything's lining up and we're not missing out on some of the multiple feet of difference between these two across the lake. And so it's not even just in one area either. It's for instance, I have a couple of figures here. The difference is positive 3.48 feet to go from NGVD 29 to NAVD 88 at Saltaire. It's 3.06 feet at our lake level gauge and sailing. So half a foot of difference in Great Salt Lake is really quite considerable. And otherwise, all the data sets married together really quite nicely and provided a nice data set for us to work with. And then from there, it was a pretty simple XYZ volume calculation. With ArcMap or ArcGIS it reproduces a tool within it called storage capacity. You put in your contour or your interval that you want to test at, and just kind of button it up and get your area or your elevation area and volume relationships pretty straightforward. And so the total bathymetry that we produced and published is a 32 gigabyte raster. It's pretty unwieldy. And so to simplify this process, we resampled down to 5 meters, did some sample checks or some elevation checks to make sure nothing was changing during that resampling, and it all kind of worked out really nicely. And so a big part of this, especially when working with outdated legacy data, is to make sure you have some kind of error bounds present. And like I said, there's an overlap between the LiDAR and the bathymetry, which is just absolutely critical to having some kind of confidence in this model. And so in the north arm, Rob was able to get a little bit higher on the shoreline for the year that he did it. So there's a little bit more of an overlap here. And this image that I have shown is the green. The green is the area where the overlap exists, and then all those white points are just randomly assigned points where it was just testing the differences in elevation between the two data sets. So there's way more overlap in the north and the south. But in the north, the average difference between the bathymetry and the LiDAR was 7 centimeters. So that's a number that I'm very comfortable with. The median difference, 9 centimeters. South arm wasn't as great. There just wasn't as much data. There was no change in methodology. Rob did the same exact thing. Most of those points are concentrated on the east side of the lake. And so those differences are a little bit more outside of the comfort zone at 55 centimeters average and 50 centimeters median. But again, just the lack of area of overlap is one of the things that we look at there. And I put a lot more confidence in what's going on in the north. And so having done all that, we have our topobathymetric data set, we have our tables. We published that on the Science Base last November. And so that was a nice treat to be able to do it. As I said, this is all in support of other studies that was going on for USGS. And so having the opportunity to be funded by Forestry Fire and State Lands, it's not that much more, but it's still quite a bit of work to get all the metadata done and kind of have it posted on our Science Base. And so as part of that data release, the 32 gigabyte raster is available, as well as the spatial metadata, which shows exactly where the data comes from for the entire data set. And we are in the process of integrating all this data in with the USGS Hydromapper. We've got some preliminary tie-ins with that, but there's going to be a lot more functionality moving forward. And then for the tables themselves, they are split into, first I do the entire lake, just strictly off of elevation, and then we segment that into Bear River Bay and Farmington. And so these were easy delineations, the causeways and the bridges. But the data set itself is outlined in a way that we hope is malleable if anyone wanted to focus on something in particular. Someone today I was talking to, they were interested in volumes in the wetlands. In an ideal world, if you have a little bit of GIS savviness, then you could plug this and pull out the data and recreate the process on one zone. But it's not for it's not a map that you just pull up and run with. And so for those tables, try to make it as easy on the user as possible. So we have SI and US customary units, as well as both datums as well, because at least in terms of, let's say how Christine uses this database off of lake levels, that's all in one datum versus how a geographer might deal with this. That'd be in a modern sense in the modern language. And so for applications, this is interpolated bathymetry, except for the LiDAR. The LiDAR is real topography, but the bathymetry itself is interpolated. So there's some data. This is best This is most representative of what Great Salt Lake looks like as a whole in a volumetric or superficial sense. And so if you're modeling water quality or salinity, nutrients, budgeting, these kinds of lake-wide studies, it's great for that, and we have full confidence in those numbers. What it's not well suited for is anything where if you need to have a specific point anywhere in the bathymetry, it's probably not effective. But over the whole, it gets smoothed out, and it's representative of what the Great Salt Lake is as a whole. I've heard a lot about the microbial studies today. Sorry, it's not great for you, but hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll have something a little bit more detailed for everyone to use. So I think with that, I just want to acknowledge the Forestry Fire Statements for allowing me to get this hosted and ready.
Thanks. This is foundational for work that we do, so all my colleagues are grateful. How do you handle or represent the light, wetland, and industrial areas?
It is strictly topography. So the idea behind this is we put the data out as unchanged as possible. And so if you can skip it out and focus on areas where you need to modify it, but this is kind of the most baseline data as we can.
The tables as available, just presented as one continuous methodology.
Strictly off of elevation. So it's looking at pixels in an XYZ sense. So the data set is 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters. Think of that as a pixel resolution with that value assigned to it. And so everything that falls below that or above it is what gets counted. And so, yeah, that was a big part of us just trying to step back from trying to work around some of the management.
Awesome, yeah. So here at U with atmospheric science, we have a couple of groups looking at where is the water, where is it wet, because this isn't that. But if we found that techno shortwave infrared channel as the most representative and most useful to try and see where the water is, or looking at the MODIS or GOES, which ones do you use and like?
So we've used that for Lake Powell and other studies, and looking at for sediment, or the plume at the deltas are for that kind of work. And so I was just used to that, and it really just outlines the likeliness. So it made for a good figure. Thank you very much.